I grew up in Coorparoo. My sister was 3 years older than I and my brother 3 years younger. And my father died when I was 9, which we had a really happy, loving family, and so that was a great tragedy. And then I went to school at the convent at Coorparoo for 9 years, and then I went to secondary school over at Hawthorn at Leeward Hill College. And then in my last year I was toying with going teaching, but by the end of the year I decided definitely to go nursing. So I went and trained at Holy Spirit Hospital up on Wickham Terrace, which is now Brisbane Private Hospital, for 4 years. And then I went to Sydney and did midwifery at St Margaret's and mothercraft at St Anthony's. Came back to my Holy Spirit for a couple of months, and I was thinking about joining the CMF because I had this great feeling that we should do time in the services if we could. And so coincidentally, a lady I was working with at Holy Spirit had been in the CMF for years, and so I decided to join CMF full-time rather than the regular army to see how it went. And then about 4 or 5 months after I joined the full-time CMF, I signed over to 2 years reg. And I was when I did join the full-time CMF, I was posted to 1 mil at Yeronga, which was in Kadumba Street. The hospital's now at Enoggera, but it was at Yeronga then. And so that was my first year in the army. There were 3 wards, 2 surgical and medical, and when you worked in the medical ward, that covered the casualty. And so I worked in mainly medical ward for about 6 months, and then one morning after night duty, matron called me aside and asked me if she wanted me to go and do time in the operating theatre. And I was fortunate because during our training, I'd trained with mainly they were American, German or Dutch nuns, and they insisted on doing extra time in the theatre, different from the other hospitals here. And so I looked forward to that, and I went up and worked at the theatre there in 1 mil for 6 months. And at the end of that time, when matron gave me a post, she said there was a posting to Vietnam, and they'd already marked me before I went to theatre that perhaps I'd be suitable to go to Vietnam, and that's why they put me in the theatre then. I didn't know that, to give me some more experience. And so the theatre at 1 mil, we were doing a lot of called DPCs, the delayed primary closures. So we were seeing a lot of the wounded, but of course they were just, a lot of post-op care. Because with the DPCs, the delayed primary closures, you don't close the wound till there's no infection, no inflammation, no fluid, extra fluid. So often they'd come back within 5 days if the medevac fight was coming, and so we'd do the DPCs at 1 mil. My brother was in national service, and he was going to Vietnam, and he was nearly ready to go when I got the posting, but I didn't tell anyone in the family because I thought it was a bit much. So I thought, so when we went to Sydney to see him, no one knew I was going to Vietnam. But I remember whispering to him, "I'll see you at Vung Tau in a couple of months." So I didn't tell. Probably it was a few weeks before I went overseas that I told the family. I was lucky in the theatre at 1 mil because the girl who was in charge of theatre, and I think all the medics, had been to Vietnam. So I learnt a lot, and I heard a lot from them about what to expect at the theatre in Vietnam. My brother actually had been in part-time CMF here in Brisbane, so he actually volunteered for national service, because if you're in the CMF here, you didn't have to, I think you're exempt from national service, but he volunteered. So that's why, even though he was a national serviceman, he still got he doesn't have a national serviceman's number, he has his CMF number. I remember being up at my aunt's place. My mum's sister lived at Coorparoo as well, and we spent a lot of time there, so I waited till we were all up at her place one night, and I just told them, and I just remember them all looking to one another. And but they were very supportive, very supportive. But they kept saying how just reminded them of the Second World War, and I remember thinking, how can you remember that? It was like 25 years ago. I mean, to me, it's no wonder she thought it was like yesterday. She said, but it's like yesterday. It is like yesterday when you think of 25 years. We were leaving from Sydney, So some of the family came down to Sydney to see me off, and when I got to Sydney, I met up with another girl, Faye, who I'd worked with in Brisbane, but she was working down south then. So we were going together, and we went over to North Head, I think. It was over at North Head somewhere there where we spent quite some time there, and then my cousin who lived on the North Shore, we were allowed to go to her place for a few hours, and then we all went to the airport that night. The plane left maybe 10 o'clock or something. And then we caught up with a Red Cross girl who'd come over from Perth. And so the three of females, we were going, and the matron in chief was there to see us off. There was a big farewell, and there was an entertainment crew down the back of the plane, but I think there were one or two girls there, but the rest of it was just all boys. And the poor Red Cross girl, when she got to Sydney, she found out that we were going back to Perth to pick up some SAS boys, so she got in touch with her family. So we got off in Perth, and there they were to say goodbye to her again, poor girl, so she had an extra trip. And so we went via Perth. And then we got to Singapore. We all had to put on our civic clothes to get off for breakfast. I had a cousin living in Singapore, so she met us and took three girls to breakfast. We got to Saigon Airport, and one of the doctors, Peter Byrne, met us, and I couldn't believe how busy it was. It was so busy. I couldn't believe there was efficiency out of all this chaos. And I remember the heat hitting us, of course. So then we went up in what do you call those planes? We went up in a...
Caribou?
Yes, we went up in a Caribou. So that was an experience. And then we got to Vung Tau Airport, which was, there was a RAF base there. And then we got to the nurses' quarters, but we didn't get to unpack because the matron said, come down because there's a dust-off coming in soon and you'll be working in triage tomorrow, so I want you to see how it works. Well, I didn't even know what triage was, so we went down and we saw that. When we got to the quarters, a girl came and she said to me, welcome to Vietnam Old Man Hall. And my mother had talked about her for 7 years. My mother had an op in the mud, and she kept saying, one day you're going to meet this girl, one day you're going to meet this country girl. And I said, you're not Anne Hall from Kyogle. She said, so I said, oh, Mum, you're right, after all 7 years she'd been talking about it. So, but then we went down and waited and saw the dust off, and we went into triage then when the boys on the stretcher came, and the one boy on the stretcher asked, is Sister Ferguson arrived yet? And I said, yeah, that's me. And he said, oh, your brother says hi. Where did you see him? Oh, about 20 minutes ago. I thought, oh, this is real. This is real. This is a war, He's the wounded, and my brother was with him 20 minutes ago. So it really hit me. It was like you're on automatic. There was so much to do when you're going to an Ogre to get sorted out. You're having injections wherever you're getting the proper clothes that you needed. They told us, malaria, you had to wear long sleeves. It didn't matter that they were mini skirts, but you had to. So you had to get a few of the proper clothes and pack your trunk. That usually didn't arrive for weeks or months later, so you just took a case with you. There were farewells. So it was... When I remember being on the plane, and Faye was on one side of me and Carmel was on the other, and I'm thinking, how did this happen? What am I doing here? It just happened. Just did it. Because when I joined the army, I never thought about going to Vietnam. I just wanted to help the boys who were wounded, and I didn't think past that. We had a 50-bed medical and a 50-bed surgical ward and 10-bed intensive care ward and the theatre and the RAP, the aid post. So one girl worked full-time in RAP, and I triaged in the theatre staff with the same staff, and I didn't do a lot of time in theatre, but I did when it was busy, or the theatre sister and I didn't go out of the compound at the same time. One of us was always there, or if she was on leave or whatever, I was always on call for her. So, but my most vivid memories are intensive care. For some reason, I did a lot of time there. Before we went to going back, when I was at 1 mil, matron said, you know, it was a privilege to go to Vietnam. She said, you know, only certain people are selected, and we've been thinking about you since you joined the army, and that's why we put you in theatre. So we did. We felt it was a big privilege. So intensive care, I don't remember the first time I worked in intensive care. I might have worked with a sister, but I might have. Because there was only one sister at a time in intensive care, and the rest were medics who were just amazing, amazing boys. Every department they worked in, they did their best. So I learned a lot from them, and the hours were long. Usually I worked night duty 1 week and day duty 1 week, and the hours were 7 to 7, but for that fortnight you work 7 nights night duty and 6 days day duty, so long shifts, and you were busy the whole time. If we had more than 4 patients in intensive care, we often got a second medic, but it was very busy. As soon as there was a contact in the bush, a siren would sound over the hospital, and it went as far down as the beach. So even if you were off duty, you came and saw if you were needed, because by that time we knew after a while we knew how many walkers and how many stretchers were coming in. And so if there were 4 stretchers coming in, we had 4 stretchers out at the chopper pad ready to put back on the chopper. And the boys were all out there meeting. And the worst thing was when the second siren would sound, about 3 minutes before the chopper landed. And the worst thing was when the first siren sounded and the second one didn't for ages, because you knew the chopper was under ground fire and couldn't land, so that was quite distressing. And so the boys were out at the chopper pad. There's lots of pictures of them waiting at the chopper pad for the chop. And the specialist would go out to the chopper pad if we had a severe head injury or a severe eye injury. And if the patient needed stabilising, we'd bring them in and do that. Otherwise, we'd send them straight to Long Bin, the American hospital where those specialists were. Otherwise, they'd come in, and the sickest patient would go up to the top bay, and it looked like there was no drama, but it was quietly efficient. Everyone knew what they had to do. Someone was even writing down everything that you took off the digger to put in, in his bag for him. And someone would, when they were still on the ground, we would cut up through their laces, right through their clothes, take off their and lift them up so we could examine their back before we put them on the trolley. And we had trays underneath the trolley that the X-rays could slide straight under. And then someone was putting in the drip, and the pathologist was standing right by to take the blood at the same time, and catheter, whatever. And the first drip we put in had 20 million units of crystalline penicillin, which is a big dose. And so by the time the patient was prepped, the medics were inside. You could see if there was whether he needed laparotomy or thoracotomy, whatever. And so the boys had gone through into the theatre and were already scrubbed and ready. And by the time the surgeon came in, and the anaesthetist had the patient there and were ready to go. So this all happened maybe. If the choppers weren't under ground fire, this could all be happening within 25 minutes of them being wounded. So it was a very, very efficient system. You don't get it in an accident centre today, because we had the specialists there. You have the junior residents, senior residents in accident centres, and then the registrar. So it was best care ever, best.
Sounds rapid and efficient.
And yes, because one set of doors came into triage and the other set of doors led into the theatre, so there wasn't any coming and going and taking them out from here, and they went straight through into the theatre. And yeah, it was just mainly the medics. I just can't speak highly enough of them. It wasn't a mobile hospital, it was a fixed hospital at Vung Tau, so they weren't tents to start with. I mean, they were to start with, I think, when the first girls went up. But by April 1968, the hospital had been established, and we did have a bit of light relief because it was so stressful. We had music playing in the theatre usually. We had two beds in one theatre and one bed in another theatre, which was unusual. Because sometimes the anaesthetist had to go between the two with the help of medics. But the surgery was massive. Often it would go for 8-9 hours because there was so much to do. There was no one to relieve us. Some swing doors from the other side of the theatre led to a recovery room area, and the boys from the kitchen would bring over the big silver traymobiles with trolleys with food on them. So we'd go out there for a meal break and go back in. And then from that recovery room, the swing doors led into the intensive care. So that's how they got from theatre to intensive care. No, I don't think, we never thought about, I've been here for so long, because the work was there to do, so you just did it. You just didn't, when we got off, sometimes we literally had to walk through the mess to get to our nurses' quarters, so sometimes we'd sit in those cane chairs for a while before we got down to our quarters. Usually in intensive care it was 7 to 7. Sometimes if we were lucky and we had an extra sister in the surgical ward, you'd work 7 to 3 or 3 to 11, which was, 8-hour shift. Oh, we'd think that's really good. So I'm working only 8 hours today. There's the girl in charge of the surgical and medical ward. I think she usually used to work 7 to 5. That was her regular hours. If we had an extra sister, and you work 3 to 11, sometimes occasionally on night duty in surgical ward you didn't have to start till 11. But mostly it was 7. And we had one, in the nurses' quarters, we had one air-conditioned room with 2 beds in it for the night duty staff, which was nice. I was looking in my diary and I've got one patient in particular who had ileostomy, colostomy, thoracotomy, fractured ribs, amputation of his leg. So you had numerous injuries for one person. You could have numerous injuries for one person. And then, of course, burns, well, you had to have a thoracotomy, and often with a respirator because they'd swollen so much they couldn't. In fact, a friend of my brother's, I'd met him down at the Badcoat Club just the week before. It was around Easter, I think. And he was in intensive care that night, and I didn't recognise him because he was burnt and he had and when I came back the next night, his trachea was out, and he said, "What?" I said, "Oh, look, I was so busy. I didn't want to, I didn't recognise you. You were so injured." And just to do the dressings could take ages. You could use a whole big, large tin of Chilgro, that's that Vaseline, so just in a wound because they were often so deep. It took a long time. Occasionally when I had time off, I'd go with the Red Cross girl because she'd go visit the Australian patients up there at Longben, and I'd go with her. And that was, I think it was the largest American base maybe in the world. It was so big you couldn't see the extent of it. It was massive. And the hospital just went on and on and on. And they had the reverse of our triage system. They had so many casualties coming in, they had to put their really severely wounded over there because they didn't have time to, otherwise other people would have died. So we treated our worst injured first, but they couldn't often because they had so many. They had to treat the ones that they knew they could save. So that was horrible for those girls. I think I started night duty one night about 7 when he came in from theatre. Bilateral amputation, and he was just amazing. His attitude to life, he was so grateful to be alive. And it was such a privilege to look after him. At the Welcome Home Parade, I caught up with him. That was 1987. The ABC organised that, and my brother said to me later on, I've got a photo of his dust-off. What? And my brother was out in the field that day in his APC, and he took a photograph of the stretcher being loaded into the chopper, and you can see the front of my brother's APC. They're in the camera. So I said, I don't know if Graham. So I said to Graham, he said, yeah, send it over. So that was so extraordinary that my brother took the photo, and then 17 years later I caught up with him, and then I could send him the actual photo of his dust off. I don't remember him ever, even in ICU, saying he was in pain. We kept up the pain medication fairly well, but no, he was such a good patient. A lot of those boys, even in triage, they'd say, "Oh, I'm okay, sis, I saw my mate go down, look after him." He did amazing things, Graham. He became the Minister for Sport and Recreation in Western Australia, the Minister for Police. He was as head of the RSL in Western Australia. I think he threw his legs away, his artificial legs away, years and years and years, because they were just cumbersome then in the 70s. And you just much faster to get around in a chair. I was having a day off, so I was very excited about that, a day off. So I got up early and got ready, and I thought I'll spend the day writing letters home, because I got letters every single day that I was in Vietnam from people in Australia that were so kind. So I was going to write letters home. Mate rings up and says, "Don't go anywhere today, we think we're going to need you." So by maybe 10 o'clock, I think I was down in triage and theatre, and we worked till about 1 a.m. and we went off. We'd done the most emergency surgery, and then we thought we'd have a break, but someone was bleeding, so we had to go back, take him back to theatre in a hurry, and so we just kept working. And I think we finished about Monday afternoon, I think. It just went on and on. We might have had a break somewhere on Sunday night. But we did about 25 ops, which doesn't sound much, but when they're hours and hours and hours long, it was. We got, that Saturday was 8 Battalion got into trouble in the morning and 6 Battalion got into trouble in the afternoon, so they just kept coming. I think we got 9 dead and about 29 severe. 25 ops we did, 4 were wounded but didn't need surgery, so, but the others were all severely wounded. So that was a really bad weekend for those boys. We were just going to save them. We were going to keep working on them until they survived. We have to remember, see, they were fit before they were wounded. That was a plus. So all their major organs were fit unless they were injured there and then. That triage was extraordinary the way it worked, which was frustrating when you get back to Australia, because nothing ever compares to it. You can't find that expertise or efficiency or satisfaction. We lived in Double Bay when we were first married, so I got a job at I went to get a job at St Luke's at Potts Point. Oh, says the matron, it says here you trained at Holy Spirit. Is that a Catholic hospital? I said, yeah. She said, oh, we don't have Catholics here. Oh, okay. It was not, that was Church of England, I think, at the time. So I found a private hospital at Rose Bay. I thought that was convenient, but that was a bad choice, because it was run by 2 doctors and a pharmacist, and they kept reminding us every day this was a money-making concern, so that was a bit difficult. And there was a lot of elective surgery. They were just there for plastic surgery or whatever. So I left there after about 6 or 7 months. It was very, very hard. In fact, I hadn't heard a bell, because we don't have bells in the army hospitals. Someone would just call out, or someone would always in the ward, staff. So the bell rang, and a bell. So I ran, and she was sitting up saying, it's 11:30 and you haven't brought me my brandy before lunch? Well, so I just really lost it. Told her how dreadfully selfish she was, and I have to say her husband clapped and said, yeah, I've been wanting to say that for years, but that's beside the I just thought, I'm getting out of here, I can't deal with it. It was terrible. So I left there and went to a oncology ward for a few weeks till I started a paediatric certificate. I noticed all of us did a lot of postgraduate certificates or study. I think we were trying to emulate the sort of satisfaction, but it never worked. A lot of them wrote to me when they went home. I got a lot of letters in the next year particularly, or while I was in Vietnam, I got a lot of letters from them. Yes, because the fact that I can still remember their names. But intensive care, because it's virtually one-on-one rather than a 50-bed surgical ward, so you got to know them much, much better. And we do 10 or 15-minute observations with everything. So you were there by the bed all the time doing things. We used to load the drip. We didn't have broad-spectrum antibiotics then, so we used to have to put 5 or 6 different antibiotics in the drip bottle, which meant we had to take some fluid out of the 1,000ml glass bottle, otherwise you couldn't get the antibiotics in. So, and sometimes you'd spend ages just loading and then the pathologist would come in and say, no, we need different fluid in that, so that'd have to be discarded and you'd start again. So that was very time consuming, because the pathologists were always there taking the bloods because they could go off so fast. No, it was... So you were there by their bed, working with them all the time and got to know them really well. If you got to work at 3 to 11, you thought you had you were out until 2 o'clock, so you had time off then. Days off, I went with a couple of the boys. We used to help out at the orphanage. We used to help out there. One of my friends who actually stood on a mine on the 24th of April, but until then he used to come to if he came down from the dad, he would bring his extra rations and we'd take those out. And so he came to the orphanage a few times, and even after he went back to Adelaide, one of his mates helped me with some rations. Went to the beach, wrote letters home, went into... there were a couple of nice restaurants in town. We went with people. It's about as much time as we had. Oh, and I went up to Long Bin with Carmel, and she also did the Red Cross girl. She also did the radio station over at the RAF base at Vung Tau. So I went over there to the radio station with her a few times. She had a program. On the radio, Carmel. Oh, the Red Cross hut, sometimes I would work, I'd go in there because the boys had occupations there and things to do, and I'd go, and sometimes I went down to the beach with her. They had a Red Cross van to help the walking wounded. She'd take them down to the beach and I'd go with her with that as well. The Red Cross girls were quite busy. They're very active, and they had a lot of access to areas. They seemed to be able to go wherever they wanted to go. The fact that she could just get on and go to Long Bin, I don't know how she organised that. The first day I was in Vietnam, I worked in the theatre, and when we were finished work, I was about 5 o'clock, I think, that day. June, who was a theatre sister, said to me, let's go to the medical ward. I've got a friend there, a patient. So that's where I met Denis. And I don't know how long he was in for that time. But he'd been out bush with my brother, so he knew who he was. And so he was in and out of hospital, plus he was up and down from the DAT. So it just grew. Just talked to him sometimes for ages on the phone, which wasn't very private, because often when he was even in Cambodia or Canto, wherever, you'd have to go through 3 or 4 or 5 switchboards, so they'd all listen in and interrupt if they thought. So that was really exciting. Get off the phone, I'd say. Oh, sorry, ma'am. So yes. And it just grew. Denis was always in the bush. See, a lot of journalists work from the office. They didn't go out as much as he did, but he was always out in the bush. I remember once at somewhere, and this fellow was, and Pete, my brother, was there, and this fellow was saying, he was talking about some experience, and he said, and here we all were on our stomachs trying to withdraw, fighting away, and I looked around, he said, and I heard a click and I turned around to shoot him, but it was this mad bugger with a camera. So he said we were trying to withdraw and he's crawling up the path to take pictures. So I guess it was a bit frustrating for him when we came home because as working for UPI you could work as a photojournalist, but back here the unions they'd let you work only as a journalist or a photographer. They said you were taking away someone's job. So that was very frustrating for him that he couldn't do both. In the UPI office in Saigon, all I remember is the clacking of those machines that with the news coming in and out, whatever. There was a female journalist, Maggie Kilgore. I don't know where she worked, but she seemed to come and go. And some of the others, no, they seemed to be hanging around Saigon. Denis was never arrogant. He was really humble with what he knew, but if you talked to him in depth, he was so informative. And I think that's why he didn't involve himself a lot with the other journalists in Saigon, although he knew them really well because we'd often go to not often, we went to the Caravel, there's a bar right up on top of the roof garden up there, which we went to again in 2016. But they used to have stories more than he did. And I remember even at the time thinking, how do you know all that when you're in your office? So, no, he knew it all from personal experience. Well, the first time was over the phone because I remember saying, one doesn't propose to one over the phone. And he said, but I can't get down to the base till whatever. And I said, yeah, but he said, I can't get down to whatever. He was somewhere up with the Montagnards, I think then. Anyway, so that happened when he came down to base, and we had an engagement party in the mess, which was lovely. And I remember a lot of people came down from Nui Dat from it, so people he knew. I didn't know those people. I just knew the ones at the hospital. So in the meantime, I used to just get lots and lots of letters, lots and lots of phone calls, poetry in them. And then we were able to get into Vung Tau to the restaurants there quite a bit and my brother was even there a few times and with the other people from the hospital, which was really nice. And the CO had a sitting room in his hut, so we could often go there for a talk or or down the beach if we didn't want to go to the ORs, if we didn't want to go to our own officers' mess. When my brother came down, because he was a trooper, he wasn't allowed into my officers' mess, so the CO used to let us have his hut to catch up in if we needed it, or I could go to the OR's mess with my brother. You couldn't stay in the army if you got married, and I wanted to get married more than I wanted to stay in the army. So, and Denis was, let's go home. So and I had to get married within a month, I think it was. So we got married about 10 days later. When we got home, we got married about 10 days later in Brisbane here at Coorparoo, and then we went to Sydney. That's where he came from. And he worked in Sydney. I came back on an army military flight, and he came back a couple of days later. He didn't come back on the same plane as I did, but my brother did. Mum didn't know she thought he was coming the week later, so that was an extra surprise when they all came out the airport and he was there as well. I think Mike Norton, the CEO, had asked him to take some specific photos maybe of theatre, and he said, do you want me to do the whole hospital? So he did, and it was such a record because Denis never asked, when he took photos, he never asked anyone to pose. He always just, even with the children, he just took them, and I think it's really effective, and the coverage of that hospital is really unique, those photos that he took. And the fact that he did it when I was there, it's really wonderful because I know most of the people in all those photos. When I went to Vietnam, the first, I think 2 or 3 days, I started counting people I knew from Brisbane, and I got up to 60 and then I stopped counting it. It was the most privileged time of my life to have been there, and it's the best nursing I did and could ever have given under the circumstances, and I've never been able to replicate it here, even though I've gone on to have, 7 certificates or something. I was trying to be able to be the best nurse I could, and then I went and did a degree. I was trying to find some of the same satisfaction, but it never happened. So it was the most, in my nursing career, that was the most privileged, the most satisfying time I ever spent. And it won't ever happen again, it just can't. And the fact that everyone over there at the hospital, it was in the middle of ALSG, the Australian Logistics Support Group. There were 2,000 Australians down there at Vung Tau. And everyone was military, which gave a real cohesion to it. The pathologists, the dentists, the outpatients, the people in the kitchen, the maintenance people, everyone had this common thing. We're all in the military, and everybody was there to help the wounded, the boys. So it was, you can't replicate that in a civilian hospital because everyone has their own agenda. And even the RAP girl, she was quite busy because she had to look after the 8,000 Australians that weren't wounded. So that was, they were busy there in RAP. Anyone that got anything wrong with them, physical or medical or keeping up the injections. Those protests in America started earlier than here. I think they started here in 1969, 1970. So when I went away, I wasn't totally aware of it. By the time I came back, there were protests, and I knew not to... I didn't mention when I was working, the first few hospitals I was working at, I don't remember mentioning I'd been to Vietnam. For some reason, I just got the impression, don't do it. It was not acceptable. So that had all changed in 12 months because when we first went over, it seemed to me like everyone supported it. And I think if it looked like we'd been winning, they would have still supported it. But then, 69, when the casualties started probably increasing, and it was only a small group of left-wing radicals that started the protest movement, but then they could garner a lot of people in there with them. Yes, it had changed in 12 months. It had changed. I read a lot about it in the late 60s, and it was just mainly news without journalists putting their own spin on it like they do today. And then they were very heavy on reporting the protests when I came back, very heavy on that. Jim Cairns seemed to always be in the news more than Vietnam. So the journalists had changed. But it's like picking up either, I don't know, today, a Guardian magazine or a Spectator magazine. It's the same story, total opposites. Well, we didn't know about PTSD in the early 70s or we didn't know about PTSD till probably, I don't know, mid-80s. So, the nightmares, the not sleeping, the wandering around, the being able to deal with big issues, but little trivial ones would set you off. We didn't think that it might have been from Vietnam. We just tried to deal with it. We just thought it was, I don't know, he was studying, I was studying, I was working, he was working. Whatever happens, you try and deal with it, but then later on you realise what was happening. He was just so imbued in his psyche that was his, he thought, you could see, looking back, you could see he thought about it 24 hours a day. And his work here was so frustrating, as I said. He ended up doing the microfilming for the State Office block, which meant he had to travel around New South Wales quite a bit to the different schools and unis and that to take the pictures to Bug. And so that helped him a bit. He quite liked that, getting out of the office and getting around. But the fact that he couldn't write stories with his pictures was just awful. He could talk to things that he didn't talk to anyone else about, and vice versa. There's a lot I talked about with him, but it wasn't enough because I didn't recognise that, neither of us recognised the symptoms of PTSD. One day when I was walking just before I finished work at Prince of Wales, I was crossing at the crossing there in High Street, and a chopper was coming up and I just and walked straight down to the traffic towards it. Oh dear, better do something about this. Not good. Yeah, you hear the chopper, you go to the triage. And it was good for everybody because we didn't know who was going to turn up, and 20,000 people turned up. It was extraordinary. They did an enormous job organising that, and that's where I caught up with Graham Edwards after 17 years, at the dawn service. I think it was cathartic for everybody who went, and a lot of people regretted not going after the fact. Also, we opened our memorial in Canberra in 1992, which was well received, and the thing about the Welcome Home Parade I remember was there were no protesters. That was so significant, walking through the streets. Everyone was, and you could see a lot of Second World War men were there. If I don't make the dawn service here, I go to, there's 2 local ones, and then I'll come into the march and we'll catch up after. We'll catch up after with the group. When I did a tour of the Somme on the Western Front in 2016, that became very poignant, and I was at Villers-Bretonneux for Anzac Day that day, so that whole Remembrance Day thing has become more significant for me now. And Veterans Day, we always do something, yes. And I help at the RSL with Remembrance Day and Anzac Day. I helped them out the week before that. I just can't speak highly enough of the medics I work with. It wouldn't have been viable without those boys. They were so devoted, so caring, went out of their way to help the boys, the patients. I think with the National Service Fellows, I think in those days if you failed one year at uni, you were called up. You could keep deferring while you were passing at uni. So we had a lot of National Service Fellows that had been studying teaching or science or medicine or dentistry, but I didn't distinguish who was a National Service and who was a young reg, but they just all worked and helped each other, but they were so knowledgeable and really we never complained about the shifts we were working. And often those boys had worked those shifts and then they went and did picket duty. It needed to be done. Everything was to sort those choppers out when they came in.